A wedding without a bride? Have you ever heard of such a thing? The chandeliers hung like frozen tears above the empty altar. The white roses were beginning to wilt in their crystal vases, and 300 guests sat in suffocating silence, their whispers sharp as broken glass. The groom stood alone at the front of the cathedral, his hands trembling as he clutched a letter that had arrived just an hour before the ceremony. The ink was smudged, as if written in haste, or perhaps through tears. And in that moment, everyone in that room knew that the marriage arrangement that had been 20 years in the making had just collapsed in the most spectacular and scandalous way imaginable. But this story doesn't begin here, in this cathedral full of shattered expectations. It begins much earlier, in a winter so cold that even promises froze solid before they could be spoken aloud. It begins with two families, bound not by love, but by legacy, by land, by the kind of obligations that get passed down through generations like heirlooms no one wants, but everyone must carry. The Hastings family owned the northern estates, vast stretches of countryside that rolled like waves toward the mountains. The Carmichael family controlled the southern valleys, fertile lands that fed half the region. Together, they weren't just powerful, they were untouchable. And to keep it that way, they made a promise, a cold promise, one that would bind their children before those children even had a say in their own futures. Elena Hastings was 7 years old when she first learned she would marry Thomas Carmichael. She was sitting in her father's study, a room that smelled of old books and pipe tobacco, when he told her with the kind of finality that left no room for questions. Thomas was 9, already groomed for leadership, already taught that duty came before desire. They met once a year at the Winter Ball, an event both families hosted in alternating estates. They would dance one obligatory dance, exchange polite pleasantries, and then retreat to opposite corners of the ballroom like chess pieces waiting for their next move. There was no warmth between them, no curiosity, just the weight of expectation, heavy as snow on a fragile branch. Elena grew up under that weight. She learned to smile at the right moments, to nod when the adults spoke of wedding dates and honeymoon destinations she had never asked about. She learned to bury the things she wanted beneath the things she was told to want. And for years, it worked. She convinced herself that love was a luxury, that contentment could be built on stability and shared responsibility. She told herself that passion was a myth sold in novels, that real life was about compromise and practicality. She almost believed it. Almost. Then came the summer she turned 23. The summer everything changed. Her father sent her to oversee the restoration of an old estate on the border between Hastings and Carmichael land. It was a neutral property, forgotten by time, a sprawling manor with ivy-covered walls and gardens that had gone wild. The project was meant to be simple: hire a crew, supervise the work, return home before autumn. But nothing about that summer would be simple, because that's where she met him. David. The architect who had been brought in from the city, someone with no ties to either family, no knowledge of the promises that had been made before he was born. He arrived on a morning wrapped in mist, carrying rolled-up blueprints under one arm and a leather satchel over his shoulder. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead, eyes that seemed to notice everything, and a way of speaking that made even mundane things sound like poetry. He talked about the bones of buildings the way others talked about music or art, seeing beauty in structure, in the way light moved through windows, in the stories walls could tell if you knew how to listen. Elena found herself listening, and then she found herself looking forward to his arrival each morning, the sound of his footsteps on the gravel path, the way he'd smile when he caught sight of her waiting on the terrace. They started with conversations about crown molding and foundation repairs. Then the conversations drifted toward books, toward memories, toward the kinds of dreams people only share when they think no one important is listening. He told her about growing up in a small apartment above his father's bookshop, about nights spent reading by candlelight when the electricity went out, about the way his mother used to hum while cooking, filling their cramped space with warmth. She told him about the coldness of the Hastings estate, about dinners where silence was enforced like law, about the way she sometimes felt like a portrait hanging on the wall, admired perhaps, but never truly seen. The work on the manor stretched through June and into July. The gardens were cleared, the windows replaced, the floors restored to their former glory. But Elena kept finding reasons to stay. Another issue to address. Another decision to make. The truth was, she wasn't ready to leave. Wasn't ready to return to the life waiting for her, the one already written, already decided. Here, in this forgotten place, she felt something she'd never felt before. She felt awake. David made her laugh in a way that felt like rebellion. He challenged her opinions, listened to her thoughts as if they mattered, looked at her like she was someone worth discovering rather than a duty to be fulfilled. The first time he kissed her, it was raining. They'd been caught in a sudden downpour while walking the property line, and they'd run for shelter beneath the old stone archway near the eastern wall. Water dripped from the ancient stones above them, and she was laughing, breathless, her hair plastered to her face. He reached out to brush a strand away from her eyes, and the gesture was so tender, so natural, that when he leaned in, she didn't pull away. She should have. She knew she should have. But she didn't. And in that moment, with the rain falling around them like a curtain separating them from the rest of the world, Elena Hastings broke the cold promise that had defined her entire life. The summer became a secret. Stolen moments in the early morning before the workers arrived. Long evenings in the restored library, pretending to review plans while their hands found each other across the table. Whispered conversations in the gardens where no one could hear. She knew it was reckless. Knew that every moment with him was another step away from the life she was supposed to live. But she couldn't stop. For the first time, she understood what all those novels had been trying to tell her. Love wasn't a luxury. It was oxygen. And she'd been suffocating her entire life without knowing it. August arrived with the kind of heat that makes everything feel urgent. The manor was nearly finished. There were no more excuses to stay, and Elena knew that soon she would have to make a choice that would shatter everything. Return to Thomas, to the wedding planned for winter, to the life of cold promises and colder beds, or risk everything for a love that felt real, that felt alive, that felt like the only true thing she'd ever known. David never asked her to choose. He was too honorable for that. But she could see the question in his eyes every time he looked at her, could feel it in the desperate way he held her when they were alone. She made her decision on the last day of August. She sat down with trembling hands and wrote 2 letters, one to her father, one to Thomas. She sealed them with wax that felt like burning bridges, and as the cathedral bells would later toll for a wedding that would never happen, Elena Hastings was already miles away, her hand clasped in David's, driving toward a horizon that held no promises, only possibility. But standing at that altar, Thomas Carmichael read her letter one more time, his face unreadable. And then he did something that no one expected. Retry TM. Thomas Carmichael folded the letter carefully, precisely as if the paper might disintegrate if handled with anything less than absolute control. The guests leaned forward in their seats, hungry for drama, for tears, for the kind of public collapse that would fuel gossip for years. But Thomas didn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, he looked up at the sea of faces. Faces that had come to witness a union, a merger, a consolidation of power. And he smiled. Not a bitter smile. Not a broken one. Something else entirely. Something that looked almost like relief. He cleared his throat, and the cathedral fell into a silence so complete you could hear the candles flickering in their sconces. When he spoke, his voice was steady, almost gentle. He told them there would be no wedding today. He told them that Elena had made a choice, one that required courage he wasn't sure he possessed himself. And then he said something that sent shockwaves through both families, something that would be repeated and analyzed and debated for months to come. He said he was grateful, that she had freed them both from a promise neither of them had made, from a life neither of them had chosen. He thanked the guests for coming, apologized for the inconvenience, and walked out of the cathedral alone, leaving 300 people stunned into paralyzed silence. But we're getting ahead of ourselves again. Because while Thomas was standing at that altar, Elena was 300 miles away, watching the countryside blur past the window of David's old sedan. They'd been driving since dawn, following roads that seemed to lead nowhere and everywhere at once. Neither of them had a clear plan. They just knew they needed distance, needed space to breathe, needed to put miles between themselves and the life Elena was leaving behind. David kept glancing at her, as if checking to make sure she was real, that she hadn't vanished like morning mist. And Elena kept touching his hand on the gear shift, grounding herself in the solid warmth of him, in the reality of this choice she'd made. They stopped in a small town whose name Elena didn't catch, a place with one main street and a diner that looked like it hadn't changed since the 1950s. Chrome stools at a long counter, vinyl booths with cracked red upholstery, a jukebox in the corner playing songs from another era. They slid into a booth near the back, and a waitress with kind eyes and tired feet brought them coffee without asking. The normalcy of it all felt surreal. Yesterday, Elena had been fitted for a wedding dress that cost more than most people earned in a year. Today, she was drinking weak coffee from a chipped mug, wearing jeans and a sweater she'd grabbed blindly from her closet in the dark hours before dawn. David reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you okay?" he asked, and she could hear the worry beneath the question. The fear that she might regret this, that the weight of what she'd given up might crush what they had before it even had a chance to take root. She squeezed his hand and nodded, but the truth was more complicated than a simple yes or no. She felt exhilarated and terrified in equal measure, free and untethered, and completely lost. She'd spent her entire life knowing exactly where she was supposed to be, who she was supposed to become. Now she was no one, nowhere, and the blank page of it was both thrilling and paralyzing. They rented a small cottage on the coast, a weathered structure that clung to the cliffs like it was afraid of falling into the sea below. It was nothing like the Hastings estate with its marble floors and silk curtains. The cottage had uneven wooden floors that creaked at night, windows that rattled when the wind came in hard off the water, a fireplace that filled the main room with smoke unless you opened the flue at precisely the right angle. But it was theirs. They fell asleep to the sound of waves crashing against rocks, woke to seagulls crying like lost souls, spent their days exploring tidal pools, and their nights tangled together beneath quilts that smelled of salt and sea air. For a few weeks, it felt like they'd escaped, like they'd outrun the consequences of Elena's choice, like they could build a life here on the edges of the world where no one knew their names or cared about family obligations or broken promises. David found work with a local contractor, restoring old homes that had weathered too many storms. Elena took a job at the town library, shelving books and helping tourists find local histories. They were nobody special here. Just another young couple trying to make ends meet, trying to figure out what came next. And there was a strange beauty in that anonymity, in being seen for who they were rather than who they were supposed to be. But the past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you run. It arrived on a grey October morning in the form of a telegram delivered by a boy on a bicycle who seemed too young for such serious errands. Elena's hands shook as she opened it, already knowing it couldn't be good news. Her father had suffered a stroke. He was in the hospital, condition critical, asking for her. The words on that thin yellow paper felt like a rope around her chest, tightening with every breath. David found her sitting on the cottage steps, the telegram crumpled in her fist, tears streaming down her face. He didn't ask what it said. He just sat beside her and held her while she cried, while she wrestled with the guilt that had been waiting patiently in the shadows for its moment to strike. She returned alone. David had offered to come with her, but she'd refused, knowing that his presence would only make things worse, would turn her father's illness into a spectacle, would confirm every terrible thing her family believed about her selfishness. The Hastings estate looked exactly as she'd left it, imposing and cold, its windows like judgmental eyes watching her approach. Her mother met her at the door, and the look on her face was worse than anger. It was disappointment, deep and corrosive, the kind that suggested Elena had not just broken a promise, but had revealed a fundamental flaw in her character, a weakness that had been there all along. Her father looked small in the hospital bed, diminished in a way that terrified her. He'd always been larger than life, a force of nature, immovable and absolute. Now he was just an old man with tubes running from his arms and machines beeping softly beside him, marking time in electronic pulses. When he opened his eyes and saw her, something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or regret, or some complicated mixture of both. He tried to speak, but the words came out slurred, half-formed. She took his hand, that hand that had signed contracts and sealed deals and promised her to Thomas before she was old enough to understand what promises meant. Over the next few days she stayed by his bedside, reading to him from the newspapers, telling him about the cottage and the sea, and carefully editing out every mention of David, every reference to the happiness she'd found in defiance of his plans. Her mother maintained a careful distance, speaking to Elena only when necessary, each word chosen for maximum impact, designed to wound. "You've destroyed everything we built," she said one evening, her voice low and controlled. "Thomas's family won't even acknowledge us now. The merger is dead. 20 years of careful planning, gone because you couldn't control yourself." But it was her younger sister, Olivia, who told her the truth that everyone else had been carefully avoiding. Olivia was 17, still living at home, still caught in the web of family expectations, and she'd watched Elena's escape with a mixture of envy and horror. She cornered Elena in the hospital cafeteria one afternoon, sliding into the seat across from her with urgent purpose. "You need to know something," Olivia said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "About Thomas. About why he reacted the way he did at the wedding. Thomas, it turned out, had his own secret. His own forbidden romance. For 3 years he'd been involved with someone his family would never approve of. Marcus, the son of one of the estate gardeners. Someone so far below the Carmichael family's social standing that even acknowledging his existence was considered generous. They'd met during a summer break from university, had fallen in love quietly, desperately, hiding every stolen moment, every secret meeting. Thomas had gone along with the arrangement to marry Elena because he thought it was what duty demanded, because he believed that love was something you sacrificed for family, for legacy, for the preservation of order. Elena's letter hadn't broken his heart. It had given him permission to admit his own. The revelation hit Elena like a physical blow. All those years, they'd both been trapped in the same cage, pacing on opposite sides, never thinking to call out to each other, never imagining they might have been allies instead of resigned accomplices. She thought about all the winter balls, all the polite dances, all the conversations that never went deeper than weather and travel plans. They could have helped each other, could have found a way out together. Instead, they'd both suffered in silence, each assuming the other was content with the arrangement, each too afraid or too well-trained to question the cold promises that bound them. She left the hospital that evening with her mind spinning, walked the grounds of the estate in the gathering dusk. The gardens where she'd played as a child looked different now, like a museum display of someone else's life. She'd spent so much time here feeling trapped, feeling erased. But she'd never considered that everyone else might have felt the same way. That her mother's rigid control might have been a cage she'd built for herself. That her father's obsession with legacy might have been a way of avoiding something more painful, more personal. That Thomas had been drowning too, just in a different ocean. Her father died 3 days later quietly, in the early hours of morning when the hospital was at its most hushed and sacred. Elena was there holding his hand, and in those final moments, she could have sworn she saw something soften in his face, some release of the iron will that had defined him. Her mother collapsed into bureaucratic efficiency, planning the funeral with military precision, finding purpose in arrangements and protocols. And Elena realized, standing in the church where her own wedding should have taken place just months earlier, that grief and relief could coexist, that you could mourn someone while simultaneously feeling freed by their absence. She stayed for the funeral, for the reading of the will, for the endless procession of relatives and business associates who offered condolences that felt more like accusations. And then, on a cold November morning when frost painted the windows white, she packed her things again, this time without hesitation, without the trembling uncertainty that had marked her first escape. Her mother didn't try to stop her, just watched from the doorway as Elena loaded her car, her expression unreadable. Before Elena drove away, Olivia ran out, pressed something into her hand, a photograph of the two of them as children, laughing in the garden before promises were made, before duties were assigned, before they learned that love was supposed to be practical rather than real. Elena drove back to the coast with that photograph tucked into the visor, a reminder of who she'd been before the world told her who to be. The cottage appeared through the morning fog like something from a dream, and David was standing on the porch, waiting, as if he'd known exactly when she'd return. She fell into his arms, and for the first time since the telegram arrived, she felt like she could breathe again. That night, lying beside him with the sound of the sea filling the darkness, she told him everything. About Thomas, about her father's last moments, about the realization that all the promises that had shaped her life had been built on everyone's fear, everyone's inability to ask for what they truly wanted. And David, who had been so patient, so understanding, finally asked the question he'd been holding back. What do you want, Elena? Not what you think you should want, not what would make everyone else happy. What do you actually want? She turned to face him in the darkness, traced the line of his jaw with her fingertips, and for the first time in her life, she had an answer that was completely, unreservedly hers. But before she could speak, a knock echoed through the cottage, sharp and insistent, shattering the quiet intimacy of the moment. David glanced at the clock, past midnight, and exchanged a worried look with Elena. No one knew they were here. No one should be knocking on their door in the dead of night. He rose, pulled on a shirt, and moved toward the door while Elena's heart began to race. When he opened it, the last person either of them expected to see was standing on the threshold, rain-soaked and breathless, with news that would change everything yet again. Retry TM. Thomas Carmichael stood in the doorway, water dripping from his coat onto the weathered floorboards, his expensive shoes caked with mud from the cliff-top path. He looked nothing like the composed figure who had addressed the cathedral full of guests months ago. His hair was disheveled. His eyes carried the kind of exhaustion that comes from traveling through the night, and in his hand, he clutched a manila envelope that seemed to pulse with importance in the dim light from the cottage's single lamp. Elena rose from the bed, pulling a blanket around her shoulders, her mind racing through possibilities, each one worse than the last. Had something happened to her mother, to Olivia? Was there some legal consequence she hadn't anticipated, some clause in her father's will that required her presence? But Thomas's expression wasn't angry or accusatory. It was something closer to desperation, tinged with what looked almost like hope. David stepped back, allowing Thomas to enter, though the gesture was cautious. protective. The three of them stood in the small main room, the fire crackling in the hearth, casting shadows that danced across the walls like silent witnesses. For a long moment, no one spoke. The rain drummed against the windows, and somewhere in the distance, the sea roared against the cliffs, indifferent to human drama. Thomas finally broke the silence, his voice rough, as if he'd been shouting or crying or both. "I need your help," he said, looking directly at Elena. "Both of you, actually, and I know I have no right to ask, after everything, after the way our families—" He stopped, seemed to gather himself, then continued. "Marcus is missing." The name hung in the air, heavy with meaning that David couldn't yet understand, but Elena immediately grasped. She'd learned about Marcus only days ago, learned about the secret that Thomas had carried like stones in his pockets, weighing him down, pulling him under. "Missing?" she repeated, moving closer. "What do you mean, missing?" Thomas sank into the chair near the fire without being invited, the manila envelope resting on his knees. He looked like a man who'd been running for days, who'd forgotten what rest felt like. 3 weeks ago, he disappeared. No note, no warning. His father said he left for work one morning and never came home. The police won't take it seriously because— He paused, his jaw tightening. Because of who he is, who we are. They think he just left, that he got tired of being someone's secret. But Thomas knew better. Elena could see it in every line of his body, in the way his hands gripped the envelope like it was the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. "You think something happened to him?" she said softly, and Thomas nodded, his eyes finally meeting hers, and in them she saw a reflection of her own terror. What if she'd lost David? What if he'd simply vanished one day, and she'd been left with nothing but questions, and the unbearable weight of things left unsaid? David moved to the small kitchen, put a kettle on the stove, his movements careful and deliberate. He was processing, Elena knew, trying to understand why this man, who should have been their enemy, had shown up in the middle of the night, asking for help. "Why come to us?" David asked, his voice neutral, not unkind but cautious. "Why not your family? Their resources?" Thomas let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't been so bitter. "My family doesn't know about Marcus. Or they know and pretend not to, which might be worse. When Elena left, when the wedding fell apart, they went into damage control mode, salvaging business relationships, rebuilding social connections. They have no interest in helping me find a gardener's son who they'd prefer didn't exist. And Elena's family—" He looked at her apologetically. "Your mother made it clear she never wants to hear from me again. Olivia was the only one who would talk to me, and she's the one who told me where to find you." "Olivia?" Elena felt a surge of affection for her sister, for her quiet rebellion, for the ways she was finding to resist even while still living under their mother's roof. The kettle began to whistle, and David poured 3 cups of tea, bringing them over, the domestic gesture somehow grounding in the midst of this surreal midnight conversation. Thomas opened the envelope with shaking hands, spread its contents across the small coffee table. Photographs mostly. Marcus laughing in what looked like a park, unaware he was being photographed. Marcus and Thomas together in some shadowy space, a boathouse maybe, or an abandoned building, their closeness unmistakable even in the grainy image. Then other photographs, darker ones, showing Marcus talking to men Elena didn't recognize, outside places that looked rough, dangerous, the kind of establishments that existed in the margins of society. "I hired a private investigator," Thomas explained, his finger trembling as it traced over one of the darker photographs. "Someone discreet. He found these a week ago from the month before Marcus disappeared. He'd been going to this place." He tapped a photograph showing a warehouse with broken windows, graffiti crawling across its walls like angry scars. "It's in the city, in the industrial district, a place where people go when they need things, illegal things." Identity documents, passage out of the country, that sort of thing. That, Elena felt her stomach tighten. You think Marcus was trying to run away, to disappear on purpose? Thomas shook his head, but the gesture was uncertain, tortured. Maybe. Probably. We'd been arguing about going public, about telling our families. I kept saying we needed to wait for the right moment, and he kept saying there would never be a right moment, that I was choosing my family's approval over him. He was right, of course. He was always right. But I was a coward. And I thought I had time to figure it out, to find a way to have both. And then he was just gone. David leaned forward, studying the photographs with the careful attention he usually reserved for architectural plans. These men Marcus was meeting with, did your investigator identify them? Thomas nodded grimly. Smugglers. People traffickers, actually. They move people across borders, provide false documentation, but they're dangerous. Not the kind of people you want to owe money to, and Marcus didn't have money. I gave him what I could without raising suspicion, but it wouldn't have been enough for what he needed. The implications settled over the room like fog, obscuring everything, making it hard to see clearly. If Marcus had gotten involved with dangerous people, if he'd made promises he couldn't keep or bargains he couldn't honor, then his disappearance took on a much darker character. Elena looked at Thomas, at this man who should have been her husband, who would have been if they'd both been brave enough, or foolish enough, to go through with it. She saw her own face reflected in his anguish, saw what she might have become if she'd stayed, if she'd chosen duty over desire, if she'd let the cold promises shape her life into something unrecognizable. "What do you need from us?" she asked, and she could feel David's eyes on her, questioning, concerned, but not objecting. Because this was what love looked like when it was real, when it was more than just passion and stolen moments. It was showing up for people even when it was inconvenient, even when it was dangerous, because you understood their pain, because you'd been there yourself, because you knew what it meant to risk everything for the person who made you feel alive. Thomas looked between them, gratitude and desperation warring in his expression. The investigator disappeared too, 2 days ago. He left a message saying he'd found something, that he needed to check one more lead, and then nothing. His office is locked up, his phone disconnected. I went to the police again and they basically laughed me out of the station. Said Marcus probably just moved on, found someone new, and the investigator took my money and ran. But I know that's not what happened. I can feel it. He pulled out another photograph, this one clearly taken from the investigator's notes. It showed a ship, massive and rusted, docked at what looked like an abandoned port. This was the last photograph he sent me. No explanation, just this image and a timestamp from 5 days ago. I've been trying to find out what ship it is, where that port might be, but I'm one person and I'm... His voice cracked slightly. I'm terrified, Elena. I'm terrified that while I'm stumbling around in the dark, something terrible is happening or has already happened, and it's my fault because I wasn't brave enough to love him openly, because I made him feel like he had to run. Elena knelt beside Thomas's chair, took his hand the way she'd taken her father's hand in those final days. "It's not your fault," she said firmly, even though she knew he wouldn't believe her, knew that guilt was a stubborn companion that didn't leave just because someone told it to. People make their own choices. We all do. Even when those choices are influenced by the people around us, by the circumstances we're born into, ultimately we're the ones who decide. Marcus made a choice, and so did you, and so did I. The question is what we do next. David had been silent, studying the photograph of the ship with intense concentration. Now he stood, moved to a shelf where he'd stacked some of his old university textbooks, materials from his architecture studies. He pulled down a thick volume, flipped through it until he found what he was looking for. "I think I know where this is," he said, and both Elena and Thomas turned to him. "See this building in the background? That architectural style, those specific reinforcements on the dock pilings, that's from the northern ports, probably Port Merrick. It was a major shipping hub about 50 years ago, but it's been mostly abandoned since the new port opened farther south. Ships still dock there occasionally, usually ones that don't want too much attention. Thomas stood so quickly he nearly knocked over his tea. Port Merrick, that's a 6-hour drive from here, maybe less if the roads are clear. He looked at Elena, then at David, and something passed between the three of them, an understanding that required no words. They were going, all of them. Because Elena knew what it meant to break free from the cold promises, and she couldn't let Thomas face this alone when his own prison had finally cracked open enough to let him try. They left before dawn. 3 people in David's old sedan, the trunk packed with supplies hastily thrown together, flashlights, warm clothes, the envelope of photographs and documents Thomas had brought. Elena sat in the back seat, watching the sky lighten gradually from black to gray to the pale blue of early morning. She thought about her father, about how he'd spent his whole life building walls around himself, around his family, walls made of expectations and obligations and promises made in cold blood. She thought about Thomas, driving through the night to ask help from the very people his family had taught him to see as betrayers. She thought about Marcus, somewhere out there, possibly in danger, possibly already lost. The landscape changed as they drove north, becoming rougher, more industrial. They passed through towns that had clearly seen better days, places where factories stood empty and optimism had moved away to somewhere with more opportunity. David drove with steady competence while Thomas navigated, checking and rechecking the map he'd marked with possible locations. Elena dozed fitfully, her dreams filled with ships and dark water and voices calling from places she couldn't reach. They arrived at Port Merrick just after noon, and David had been right about the location. The port sprawled along the coastline like a corpse, all rusted metal and rotting wood, buildings whose windows were nothing but shattered frames, graffiti covering every available surface with layers of competing tags and messages. A few ships were docked, old cargo vessels that looked like they might sink if you stared at them too hard. The smell of salt and decay hung heavy in the air, and the only sounds were seagulls screaming overhead and the creak of metal against metal as the ships rocked gently in their berths. They parked at the edge of the port, trying to look inconspicuous, though the sedan stood out among the handful of beat-up trucks scattered around the area. Thomas pulled out the photograph again, comparing it to the ships they could see. There, he said, pointing to a vessel at the far end of the dock, rust streaking its hull like dried blood. That's the one. I'm almost certain. As they approached on foot, trying to look purposeful rather than suspicious, Elena noticed there were people here, more than she'd expected. Men loading and unloading cargo in a way that seemed deliberately inefficient, as if the work was just an excuse for being present. A woman smoking by a warehouse entrance, watching them with eyes that missed nothing. The sense of being observed, evaluated, judged, pressed down on Elena's shoulders like physical weight. They were halfway to the ship when a figure emerged from the shadows between 2 containers. He was young, maybe early 20s, with a scar running from his eyebrow to his cheek, and a way of moving that suggested violence was always an option, never far from consideration. "You lost?" he asked, his tone making it clear that being lost here was a dangerous condition. Thomas stepped forward, and Elena saw him straighten, saw him put on the authority he'd been trained to wear since childhood, the bearing of someone who was used to being obeyed. "I'm looking for someone," he said, and there was steel in his voice now, determination replacing the desperation he'd shown in the cottage. "Marcus Whitley. He came here a few weeks ago. I need to know if anyone's seen him." The young man's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a recognition or calculation. "Don't know anyone by that name," he said, but the lie was obvious, sitting there between them like something you could touch. "Lot of people come through here. Can't remember them all. Elena felt David tense beside her, sensed him preparing to intervene, but before anyone could speak, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Let them through, Kyle." They all turned to see a woman approaching, older than the young man, maybe in her 50s, dressed in practical work clothes, but carrying herself with an authority that made it clear she was in charge here. She looked at Thomas with something that might have been sympathy or might have been appraisal. "You're looking for Marcus," she said, and it wasn't a question. "You're the one he was running from." The words hit Thomas like a punch, and Elena saw him flinch, saw the guilt rise up in him like floodwater. "I'm the one trying to find him," he corrected, but his voice had lost its steel. "Please, if you know anything, if he's here, or if he was here." The woman studied them for a long moment, her gaze moving from Thomas to Elena to David, weighing something, deciding something. Finally, she nodded once, a sharp gesture. "Come with me," she said. "But understand this, if you're here to cause trouble, if you're working with the authorities or with anyone who means harm to the people under my protection, you won't leave this port. Are we clear?" They nodded, and she led them deeper into the maze of containers and warehouses, past men who stopped their work to watch, past doors that were quickly closed as they approached. The sense of entering another world, one with its own rules and hierarchies, was overwhelming. They climbed a metal staircase to an office built into the side of a warehouse, its windows overlooking the entire port. Inside, the space was surprisingly organized, clean, with filing cabinets and a desk covered in paperwork that looked entirely legitimate. The woman sat behind the desk, gestured for them to take the mismatched chairs scattered around the room. "My name is Catherine," she said. "I run operations here, legal and otherwise. Marcus came to me 5 weeks ago, looking for passage out of the country, looking to disappear. He had almost no money, but he was desperate, and I've seen desperate before. I liked him. He was honest about what he was running from or who. Didn't try to make up stories." Thomas leaned forward, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Is he alive? Please, just tell me if he's alive." Catherine's expression softened slightly, and Elena realized that beneath the hard exterior, this was someone who understood what it meant to be caught between worlds, to be someone that society had decided didn't deserve recognition or protection. "He was alive 3 days ago," she said carefully. "But he's in trouble, the kind of trouble that money and good intentions can't always fix." Retry TM. Catherine rose from her desk, moved to the window overlooking the port, her silhouette framed against the grey light filtering through salt-stained glass. The silence that followed her words felt alive, pressing against Elena's chest, making it difficult to draw breath. Thomas remained frozen in his chair, his knuckles white where they gripped the armrests, and Elena could see him warring with himself, relief that Marcus was alive, battling against terror about what trouble meant in a place like this, among people like these. "Tell me," Thomas finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it is, I need to know." Catherine didn't turn from the window. Marcus couldn't pay for passage the conventional way, the routes out of the country, the documentation he needed. We're talking about 30,000 minimum. He had maybe 3, so he made a different arrangement. She paused, and in that pause, Elena felt the story's trajectory shift, felt them moving into territory where good intentions meant nothing and consequences were measured in ways that couldn't be undone. He agreed to work off his debt, legitimate work, or what passes for legitimate here. Loading cargo, maintaining the ships, nothing dangerous. The deal was simple, 6 months of labor, then passage to wherever he wanted to go. Clean documents, a chance to start over. David leaned forward, his architect's mind already seeing the structural flaws in this arrangement. "But something went wrong," he said, and it wasn't a question. Catherine finally turned to face them, her expression grim. 2 weeks into his time here, one of the ships he was working on was boarded by customs. It was supposed to be a routine inspection, but someone had tipped them off, told them exactly where to look. They found contraband, not the usual stuff, something worse. Weapons, military grade. The kind of cargo that gets you more than fines and confiscated goods. The kind that gets you prison time, real prison, the sort of place people don't come back from the same. Elena felt her stomach drop. She looked at Thomas, saw him processing this information, saw the hope that had sustained him through the night's drive begin to crack and splinter. But Marcus didn't know, Thomas said desperately. He was just working. He didn't know what was on the ship. Doesn't matter what he knew, Catherine interrupted, her voice hard but not unkind. He was there when they found it. He was part of the crew, on paper at least. The captain managed to convince customs to let most of the workers go, claimed they were day laborers who knew nothing about the cargo. But the authorities are watching now, watching this port, watching all of us. And the people who owned that cargo, the people who lost a very expensive shipment. She stopped, seemed to be choosing her words carefully. They think someone talked. They think someone gave customs that tip, and they're very interested in finding out who. The implications cascaded through Elena's mind like dominoes falling. Marcus was trapped between law enforcement attention and the suspicion of criminals, each side dangerous in its own way, each capable of destroying him for different reasons. "You're protecting him," she said, understanding dawning. "That's why he's still here. Why he hasn't already left on another ship." Catherine nodded slowly. "He's hidden for now, but I can't protect him forever. The people who lost that cargo, they have long memories and longer reach. And if customs decides to come back with a warrant instead of just a routine inspection, if they start really digging into who was where when..." She let the sentence hang, unfinished, its dark possibilities speaking louder than any conclusion she could provide. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound like a scream. "I need to see him, now, please. I have money, real money. I can pay his debt. I can pay for his passage. I can..." "Money doesn't fix this," Catherine said sharply, and there was something almost pitying in her tone. "This isn't about debt anymore. This is about survival, yours and his. If you walk out to wherever he's hiding, you'll be seen. You'll be followed. You'll lead them right to him, whether you mean to or not. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" The room fell silent except for the distant sound of metal clanging against metal from somewhere in the port below. Elena watched Thomas struggle with this reality, saw him trying to reconcile the world he'd grown up in, where money and status could smooth over almost any problem, with this world where power was measured differently, where the rules he'd learned didn't apply. He sank back into his chair, looking suddenly older, as if years had been added to him in the span of moments. "Then what do we do?" he asked, and the helplessness in his voice broke something in Elena's chest. She'd spent so much time resenting Thomas, resenting the role he'd played in the cold promise that had defined her life, but now she saw him clearly. Just another person trapped by circumstances beyond his control, trying desperately to protect the one thing that mattered to him, and failing. Catherine returned to her desk, pulled out a battered notebook, flipped through pages covered in handwriting so cramped and efficient it looked like code. "There's a ship leaving tomorrow night. The Meridian. It's clean, legitimate cargo, regular customs clearance. I can get Marcus on it, get him across the border to where he can disappear properly, but he needs to stay hidden until then, and we need to make sure no one is paying attention when he boards." "A distraction," David said quietly, and Elena turned to look at him, saw the gears turning in his mind. That same methodical, problem-solving approach he brought to buildings and blueprints now applied to something infinitely more dangerous. You need something that will draw attention away from the Meridian, something big enough that no one will be watching one more worker boarding a cargo ship. Catherine's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Smart man," Yes, a distraction. Which is where you three come in if you're willing. And I want to be very clear, this isn't without risk. The kind of distraction we need, the kind that will work, it could go wrong. People could get hurt. You could get hurt. So I need to know right now if you're committed to this, or if you're going to walk away and let Marcus take his chances. Elena felt the weight of the choice pressing down on her, heavy as water, deep as the ocean beyond the port. She thought about the cathedral full of guests, about the moment she'd decided to write those letters, to break those cold promises, to choose love over duty. That choice had seemed monumental at the time, life-changing and irreversible. But this was different. This wasn't just about her own happiness, her own freedom. This was about someone else's life, someone else's chance to escape the same trap she'd fled. And it was dangerous in ways that her choice had never been. She looked at David, found him already watching her, and in his eyes she saw the question that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Are we doing this? Are we really going to risk everything we've built for people we barely know, for a situation that isn't our responsibility? And in her own reflection in his gaze, she found her answer. Because the cottage on the cliff, the quiet life they'd started to build, it was precious precisely because it was chosen, because it was real. And if they turned away now, if they let fear make them small, then they'd be building their happiness on the same kind of cold foundation that had imprisoned them both in the first place. "We're in," Elena said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach. "Tell us what to do." David nodded his agreement, and Thomas looked between them with an expression Elena couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with guilt, hope threaded through with terror. Catherine studied them for a long moment, then nodded once, decisive. "Tomorrow night, 8 o'clock, there's a warehouse on the east side of the port. It's where they store the high-value cargo, the stuff that gets extra security. We're going to make it look like someone is trying to steal from it. Not actually steal, just make enough noise and commotion that customs and port security all rush over there. Fire alarms, broken windows, maybe a small fire if we can control it. Nothing that actually damages the cargo, nothing that puts innocent workers at risk, but enough chaos that every eye in this place will be pointed in that direction. While Marcus boards the Meridian on the opposite side," David finished, already seeing the geometry of the plan, the way attention would flow like water toward the disturbance, leaving other areas vulnerable. "We'd need timing, precise coordination. If the distraction happens too early, security might be back in position before he boards. Too late, and they might have already sealed the ship." Catherine nodded approvingly. "Exactly. The Meridian's scheduled to depart at 9. Loading finishes at 8:30. Marcus needs to be on board by 8:15, no later, which means the distraction needs to start at exactly 8, last at least 20 minutes, and then you need to get out before anyone can identify you, before security can lock down the port." "And if we're caught?" Elena asked, needing to understand the full scope of what they were agreeing to. "If something goes wrong and we can't get out?" Catherine's expression hardened. "Then you'll be arrested for attempted theft, maybe arson depending on how the fire goes. You'll be questioned, and if they connect you to Marcus, if they figure out what was really happening—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the unspoken consequences hung in the air like smoke. Thomas had been silent through this exchange, his hands clasped so tightly in his lap that Elena could see him shaking. Now he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I should be the one doing this. The distraction, the risk, it should be me. He's my—" He stopped, seemed unable to find the right word. Lover felt too small. Partner felt too simple. "He's mine to protect." "You can't," Catherine said, not unkindly. "You're too recognizable. The son of the Carmichael family shows up at an illegal port, causing chaos. That's news. That's the kind of attention that doesn't go away. Elena and David, they're nobody here. No offense," she added, glancing at them. "But that's your advantage. You can disappear into the crowd, be written off as small-time troublemakers, maybe get a fine and a warning if you're caught. Thomas getting caught would be a scandal, would bring the kind of scrutiny that would shut down this entire operation and hurt a lot of people who depend on this port for survival. The truth of this settled over Thomas like a weight, and Elena watched him wrestle with it, watched him trying to accept that sometimes love meant stepping back, meant letting others take risks you desperately wanted to take yourself. It was the inverse of the cold promises they'd grown up with. Instead of sacrifice born from duty, this was sacrifice born from love, from trust, from the understanding that some things were bigger than personal need. They spent the rest of the afternoon planning. Catherine provided them with a layout of the port, showed them the warehouse they'd target, the routes they'd take in and out, the timing down to the minute. She gave them dark clothing, gloves, items they'd need to break windows and trigger alarms without leaving evidence of who they were. David studied the warehouse plans with his architect's eye, found the optimal points to cause the most visible disruption with the least actual danger. Elena memorized escape routes, backup plans, the way she'd once memorized dance steps for those winter balls, muscle memory for a different kind of performance. As evening approached, Catherine finally said what they'd all been thinking but no one had voiced. "You should see him, Marcus, not Thomas, still too risky. But you two?" She nodded at Elena and David. "He should know people are risking themselves for him. He should know he's not alone." She led them through the port's labyrinth, past shipping containers stacked like a child's blocks, past workers who turned away deliberately, practicing the art of not seeing what shouldn't be seen. They descended a metal staircase into what looked like a maintenance tunnel, dark and damp, the walls slick with condensation. The tunnel opened into a storage area beneath one of the warehouses, a space filled with old equipment and forgotten supplies, lit by a single bulb hanging from a frayed wire. Marcus sat on a crate in the corner, and Elena's first thought was how young he looked. 24, Catherine had mentioned, but he could have passed for younger. His face gaunt from stress and inadequate food, his eyes carrying the kind of wariness that came from being hunted. When he saw them, strangers descending into his hiding place, he stood quickly, tensing, ready to run or fight. "It's okay," Catherine said quickly. "They're here to help. Friends of Thomas." At the sound of that name, Marcus's entire body seemed to crumple, as if the armor he'd been wearing suddenly became too heavy to hold up. "Thomas sent you?" he asked, his voice cracking on the name. Is he safe?" "They didn't." "He's fine," Elena said gently, moving closer but careful not to crowd him. "He's here, actually, at the port. He's been looking for you, Marcus, for weeks. He's the one who found this place, who made all this possible." Marcus sank back onto the crate, his hands covering his face, and his shoulders began to shake with silent sobs. When I left, I thought he'd be relieved. That I was doing him a favor, removing the complication from his life. I never thought." He looked up at them, tears tracking through the dirt on his face. "I'm nobody, the son of a gardener. Why would he risk anything for me?" Elena knelt in front of him, took his hands in hers, and in that moment she saw every person who'd ever been told they were nobody. Every person who'd been taught that love was something they had to earn rather than something they deserved simply by existing. "You're not nobody to him," she said firmly. "You're everything. And tomorrow night you're getting on that ship, and you're getting out of here, and someday when all of this settles, maybe you'll find your way back to each other. But right now, you need to survive. That's what Thomas wants. That's what we're all going to make sure happens." They stayed with Marcus for an hour, David explaining the plan in careful detail, Elena simply sitting beside him in silent solidarity. When they finally climbed back up into the fading daylight, Elena felt the weight of what they were about to do settling into her bones. Tomorrow night, everything would change. Again. Either they'd succeed, and Marcus would escape to build a new life somewhere far from cold promises and family expectations, or they'd fail. And the consequences would ripple outward in ways she couldn't fully predict. They returned to Catherine's office to find Thomas still there, sitting in the same chair, looking like he hadn't moved at all. When they entered, he looked up with desperate hope. "Did you see him? Is he—" "He's okay," Elena said, scared but okay. "He thinks you're going to be relieved he's gone, Thomas. He thinks he was just a problem you had to solve." Thomas made a sound like something breaking. "I need him to know," he said urgently. "Before tomorrow night, before he gets on that ship, he needs to know that I love him. That I've loved him for 3 years, and I was just too much of a coward to say it out loud, to live it out loud. Can you, when you do this tomorrow, can you tell him?" Elena thought about all the things she'd never said to the people who mattered, all the words left unspoken because of fear or propriety, or the cold promises that told her what she was allowed to feel. "You should tell him yourself," she said. "Catherine, is there any way—" But Catherine was already shaking her head. "I'm sorry. The risk is too high. If Thomas is seen anywhere near where Marcus is hidden, if anyone makes that connection before tomorrow night, it's over. Not just for Marcus, for all of us." The office fell silent, heavy with the weight of all the things that couldn't be said, couldn't be done, couldn't be risked. They left Catherine to her preparations and returned to a cheap motel on the edge of the Port District, 3 rooms that smelled of mildew and old cigarette smoke. Elena lay in bed beside David that night, listening to the sound of trucks on the highway, thinking about tomorrow, about the moment at 8 o'clock when they would step across a line they couldn't uncross, when they would choose chaos and risk over safety and distance. "Are you scared?" David whispered in the darkness, his hand finding hers beneath the thin blanket. "Terrified," Elena admitted. "But also, I don't know. It feels right. Like this is what we broke free for. Not just to save ourselves, but to help others do the same." He pulled her closer and they lay there in the dark, 2 people who'd found each other by accident and built something intentional from that chance encounter. Tomorrow would test everything they'd built. Tomorrow would demand they be brave in ways they'd never had to be before. But tonight, they had this. The sound of each other's breathing, the warmth of skin against skin, the knowledge that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The next day passed in a haze of preparation and nervous energy. They ate breakfast without tasting the food, checked and rechecked the plan, the routes, the timing. Catherine arrived at noon with final instructions and a warning. Port security had been increased. Customs had made an unexpected visit that morning. The tension at the port was higher than she'd anticipated. But the Meridian was still scheduled to depart at 9, and Marcus was ready, waiting in his hiding place for the moment when he could finally run toward freedom instead of from danger. At 7:30, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the port in shades of orange and red that looked like fire or warning, Elena, David, and Thomas gathered one final time in Catherine's office. The dark clothing felt strange against Elena's skin, the gloves making her hands feel disconnected from her body. David had a backpack with the tools they'd need, a glass cutter, a small canister of accelerant for the controlled fire, a timer for the alarms. Thomas stood apart from them, his face a mask of controlled terror, knowing that for the next 2 hours he could do nothing but wait, nothing but hope that the people he'd asked to risk themselves would succeed. Catherine checked her watch, the gesture precise, final. "It's time," she said. "The Meridian is in position. Marcus will move into place at 7:55. At exactly 8 o'clock, you trigger the distraction. 8:15, Marcus boards. 8:30, you need to be clear of the warehouse area and heading toward your car. Any questions?" Elena looked at David, then at Thomas, then back at Catherine. All the questions she had were the kind that couldn't be answered with words. Would they succeed? Would Marcus survive? Would they look back on this night as the moment their lives found meaning, or the moment they lost everything? "No questions," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. They left the office, descended into the maze of the port one final time, and Elena felt the story they were living shift into its final act. The air tasted like salt and coming storms. The light was fading fast, shadows lengthening between the containers and warehouses. In the distance, she could see the Meridian, lit up and waiting, unaware of the role it was about to play in someone's escape, someone's salvation. They reached the warehouse at 7:58, crouched in the shadows beside its western wall, hidden from view but close enough to see the guard stationed at the main entrance, bored and scrolling through his phone. David pulled out the glass cutter, positioned it against a high window, and looked at Elena with a question in his eyes. Last chance to walk away. Last chance to choose safety over solidarity. Elena checked the time on her watch. 7:59. In 60 seconds, everything would change. She nodded to David, and he nodded back, and together they prepared to break more than just glass. Somewhere across the port, Marcus was moving through tunnels toward the Meridian, toward the future Thomas had bought for him with the help of strangers who'd once been enemies. The second hand on Elena's watch ticked toward 12, 58, 59, 8 o'clock. And David pressed the glass cutter against the window, and the night erupted into chaos, and Elena felt herself falling forward into the unknown, into the space beyond cold promises, into whatever waited on the other side of fear. Retry TM. The glass shattered with a sound like ice breaking underfoot, sharp and clean in the still evening air. David's hand moved with practiced precision, the cutter scoring a perfect circle that fell inward with barely a whisper. But it was enough. The alarm shrieked to life immediately, a wailing that split the night open, that turned every head in the port toward their location. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as David reached through the broken window and triggered the secondary alarm system, the one connected directly to port security, the one that couldn't be ignored or dismissed as a false alert. They ran. Not away, not yet. That would come later. First they needed to be seen, needed to draw attention like moths to flame. David smashed another window with a crowbar he'd pulled from the backpack, the crash echoing across the warehouse district. Elena could hear shouting now, boots on pavement, the crackling of radios as security personnel mobilized. She pulled out the small canister of accelerant, her hands shaking as she poured it in a careful line near the warehouse entrance, away from anything that could truly catch, just enough to create smoke and drama when David dropped the match. The flames leaped up instantly, orange and hungry, and Elena felt a moment of pure terror. What if they'd miscalculated? What if the fire spread? What if someone got hurt? But David was already pulling her back, and the fire was contained exactly as planned, creating a wall of light and heat between them and the approaching security guards. They sprinted between containers, their dark clothing making them shadows among shadows, and Elena could hear multiple sirens now, could see the flash of lights converging on the warehouse from 3 different directions. Behind a stack of shipping containers, they paused to catch their breath. David checked his watch. 8:04. Marcus would be moving through the tunnels now, Catherine guiding him toward the Meridian's loading area. Elena peered around the edge of the container and saw the chaos they'd created. Fire trucks arriving, security personnel scrambling to secure the warehouse, customs officials who'd been making their evening rounds, all rushing toward what looked like a major incident. The east side of the port, where the Meridian waited, was nearly deserted. Nearly. There. David whispered urgently, pointing. 2 security guards remained at the Meridian's gangway, too disciplined or too stubborn to abandon their post despite the commotion. They were watching the warehouse fire with obvious interest, but they hadn't left their position. If Marcus tried to board with them standing there, he'd be seen, questioned, possibly detained. Elena felt panic rising in her throat. This wasn't the plan. Those guards were supposed to leave, were supposed to be drawn away like everyone else. She made a decision in the space between heartbeats. "Stay here," she told David, and before he could argue, before she could second-guess herself, she was running again, but this time toward the guards rather than away from them. She emerged from the shadows near the meridian, stumbling deliberately, letting out a cry of distress that cut through the noise of sirens and shouting. The guards turned toward her, hands moving automatically toward their weapons, and Elena let herself look frightened, disoriented, desperate. "Please," she gasped. "My friend. He was in the warehouse. I can't find him. I think he's hurt." The lies came easily, pulled from some deep well of survival instinct she hadn't known she possessed. One of the guards moved toward her, reaching for his radio, and Elena let herself stumble again, catching his arm for support, leading him further from the gangway. The second guard hesitated, torn between his post and his partner, and in that moment of indecision, Elena saw a shadow detach itself from beneath the pier, saw Marcus climbing the gangway with the desperate speed of someone who knew this was his only chance. The second guard turned back just as Marcus reached the deck, but before he could call out, David appeared from nowhere, shouting about another fire on the south side of the port, pointing urgently toward a plume of smoke that didn't exist, but that the guard, overwhelmed and confused, believed must be there. By the time both guards realized they'd been misdirected, Marcus had disappeared into the Meridian's cargo hold, and Elena and David were running again, this time genuinely fleeing. Their part in this finished, their risk transformed into action. They didn't stop running until they'd cleared the port entirely, until they were back at David's sedan parked 3 blocks away, hidden among civilian vehicles where it wouldn't draw attention. Elena's lungs burned. Her hands were shaking so badly she couldn't get the car door open until David reached around her and pulled the handle. They collapsed into the seats, breathing hard, and for a moment, neither of them could speak, could only sit there processing what they'd just done, what they'd just risked, what they'd just accomplished. Thomas was waiting at the motel, pacing the small room like a caged animal. When they burst through the door at 8:43, he spun toward them with wild eyes, and Elena saw how close to breaking he was, how these past 43 minutes must have felt like years. Is he? Thomas couldn't even finish the questions, could only stand there trembling with hope and terror. "He's on the ship," David said, and those 4 words seemed to take all the air from the room. "We saw him board. He's on the Meridian." Thomas sat down heavily on the edge of the bed, his face in his hands, and the sound that came from him was something between a laugh and a sob, relief and grief mixed together until they were indistinguishable. Elena sat beside him, put her hand on his shoulder, and they stayed like that while the minutes ticked past, while the Meridian prepared to depart, while Marcus hid somewhere in its cargo hold, waiting for the moment when the engines would roar to life and carry him toward whatever future waited beyond this nightmare. At 9:07, Catherine called. "The Meridian just cleared the harbor," she said, her voice carefully neutral, professional, but Elena could hear the satisfaction beneath it. "Clean departure. No complications. He's away." Thomas took the phone with shaking hands, and Elena heard Catherine's voice soften as she spoke to him, giving him details. Marcus was safe, hidden among legitimate cargo. The ship's captain knew to look the other way. In 3 days he'd reach a port where Catherine had contacts, where he could disappear properly, start over with the documentation he needed. Thomas listened, nodded, couldn't speak through the tears that were falling freely now. Tears he'd probably been holding back for weeks, for months, maybe for 3 years. When he finally found his voice, it was to ask the question that mattered most. Will there be a way to contact him, to know he's safe?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Not directly, not for a while. It's safer that way for both of you. But I'll make sure you know when he's settled somewhere, when he's secure. After that," she paused. "After that, what happens is up to the 2 of you. But Thomas, you need to understand, He can't come back here. Not for years, maybe not ever. The people who lost that weapon shipment, they have long memories. And if you're seen looking for him, if you're connected to his disappearance, you put both of you in danger. The implications settled over the room like snow, cold and suffocating. Marcus was safe, but he was also gone. Thomas had saved him, but at the cost of losing him, at least for now, maybe forever. Elena watched Thomas process this, watched him understand that love sometimes meant letting go, meant choosing someone else's safety over your own desire, meant living with the ache of absence rather than risking the destruction of presence. They left Port Merrick before dawn, 3 people in a sedan driving south through the pre-morning darkness. Thomas sat in the back seat staring out the window at nothing, and Elena knew he was seeing things that weren't there. Marcus's face, Marcus's smile, moments they'd shared in secret, promises they'd made in shadows. David drove in silence, his hand occasionally finding Elena's, squeezing gently, a reminder that they'd done something good, something that mattered, even if the cost was written in the exhaustion etched into all their faces. They dropped Thomas at a train station in a town whose name Elena immediately forgot. He stood on the platform, looking lost, unmoored. A man returning to a life that no longer fit him, to a family that would never understand what he'd risked or why. Before he walked away, he turned back to them and his eyes held something Elena recognized. Gratitude mixed with grief, relief mixed with loss, the complicated mathematics of sacrifice. "Thank you," he said, and the words carried more weight than 2 syllables should be able to hold. For seeing him, for seeing us, for understanding that some things are worth more than the promises other people make for us. Elena got out of the car and hugged him, this man who should have been her husband, who would have been if they'd both been less brave or more obedient. "You'll find your way back to each other," she whispered, though she didn't know if it was true, didn't know if hope was promise or poison in a situation like this. Somehow. Eventually, Thomas nodded, but his expression suggested he knew better, knew that some separations were permanent, that some loves survived only in memory rather than reality. He picked up his bag and walked toward the train that would carry him back to his family, back to the Carmichael estate, back to a life of explaining and evading and learning to live with the ghost of what he'd lost to keep Marcus alive. Elena and David drove in silence for an hour, watching the sun rise over landscape that felt both familiar and foreign, as if they'd returned from another world where the rules were different, where risk and love were measured in more honest currency. Finally, as they approached the coastal road that would take them back to their cottage, David spoke. "Do you think we did the right thing?" he asked, and Elena heard the doubt beneath the question, the wondering if they'd been heroes or fools, if they'd saved someone or just delayed the inevitable. Elena thought about the cathedral full of guests, about the cold promises that had shaped her life, about the moment she'd decided to write those letters and choose uncertainty over obligation. She thought about Marcus somewhere on the ocean, sailing toward a future that was terrifying and open and entirely his own. She thought about Thomas on that train, carrying the weight of love and loss in equal measure. And she thought about herself and David, 2 people who'd found each other accidentally and built something intentional from that accident. "I think we did the human thing," she said finally. "Which isn't always the right thing or the safe thing, but it's the real thing. We saw people who were trapped, and we helped them escape. We recognized our own story in theirs, and we did what we wished someone had done for us." David nodded slowly, accepting this, and his hand found hers again on the console between them. They drove the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and when the cottage finally came into view, perched on its cliff, with the sea stretching endlessly beyond it, Elena felt something shift inside her chest. This place had been their escape, their sanctuary, the refuge they'd built from the wreckage of the lives they'd left behind. But now it was something more. It was proof that escape was possible, that cold promises could be broken, that love could be chosen rather than assigned. Inside the cottage, they slept for 12 hours straight, exhaustion claiming them the moment they lay down. When Elena woke, the sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and for a moment she was disoriented, unsure if a day had passed or a lifetime. David was making tea in the small kitchen, moving with the easy familiarity of someone who'd made this gesture 1,000 times, and the domesticity of it, the simple reality of it, made Elena's throat tight with gratitude. She joined him, and they stood together at the window watching the waves crash against the rocks below. And Elena thought about all the different kinds of love she'd learned existed. The obligatory love she'd been told to feel for Thomas. Duty masquerading as devotion. The desperate, hidden love Marcus and Thomas had shared, beautiful and doomed in equal measure. And this love, hers and David's, chosen and real and built on the foundation of mutual recognition, of seeing each other clearly and deciding to stay anyway. What happens now? David asked, echoing the question that had been hovering between them since they'd returned. They'd broken the cold promises that bound them, had helped others do the same, had proved that escape was possible. But escape was just the beginning. What came after? How did you build a life on freedom rather than obligation? How did you learn to want things simply because you wanted them, not because someone else decided you should? Elena took his hand, laced her fingers through his, felt the solid warmth of him beside her. Now we figure out what we actually want, she said, not what we're supposed to want, not what would make anyone else happy, what would make us happy. And then we try to build that. One choice at a time, one day at a time. David smiled, and it was the smile she'd fallen in love with that first morning at the manor, the one that suggested he saw possibilities where others saw only problems. I want this, he said simply, gesturing around the cottage, but meaning something larger. The life they were building, the choices they were making, the way they'd learned to show up for each other and for others who needed the courage they'd found. I want you. I want to wake up every morning and choose this again. That's what I want. Elena kissed him, and the kiss tasted like salt air and freedom, like the future they were building one intentional moment at a time. Outside, the sea continued its endless conversation with the shore, indifferent to human drama, to broken promises and found love. To the small rebellions that changed individual lives even if they never changed the world. 3 months later, a letter arrived. It had no return address, just a postmark from somewhere Elena had never heard of, somewhere that suggested tropical heat and distant horizons. Inside was a single photograph. Marcus, standing on a beach, the ocean behind him, smiling in a way that suggested peace rather than escape, arrival rather than flight. On the back, in careful handwriting, "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for the chance to breathe." Elena showed the photograph to David, and together they decided to send it to Thomas. Let him know Marcus was alive, was safe, was somewhere in the world building a life from nothing, from freedom. Whether they'd ever find their way back to each other remained unknown, a question mark that would hang over both their futures. But at least now there was a future. At least now there was possibility. That night, Elena and David walked down to the beach below their cottage, their feet leaving temporary impressions in the sand that the tide would erase by morning. The moon hung low and full, painting silver paths across the water, and Elena thought about promises, the cold ones made without consent, and the warm ones chosen freely, and the difference between obligation and devotion, between duty and love. She thought about the girl she'd been, standing in her father's study at 7 years old, learning her life had already been decided. And she thought about the woman she'd become, standing on this beach with the man she'd chosen, having helped others escape the same traps that had held her. The journey between those two versions of herself had been terrifying and necessary, had required breaking things that had seemed unbreakable, had demanded courage she hadn't known she possessed. Retry TM. David picked up a smooth stone from the beach and skipped it across the water, watching it bounce 3, 4, 5 times before disappearing beneath the surface. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd gone through with it?" he asked. "If you'd married Thomas, if we'd never met at the manor?" Elena considered the question, turning it over in her mind like sea glass worn smooth by endless waves. "I used to," she admitted. "Especially in those first weeks after I left. I'd wake up in the middle of the night terrified that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd thrown away security and stability for something that might not last. But I don't anymore. Because even if this..." She gestured between them, encompassing everything they'd built. "Even if this hadn't worked out, I still would have needed to leave. Not for you. For me. To prove to myself that my life was mine to live. That I could choose something, anything, based on what I wanted, rather than what I was told to want." She paused, watching the moonlight dance across the water, and continued. "The cold promises weren't just about marriage or family legacy. They were about teaching us that our desires didn't matter, that love was transactional, that happiness was a luxury we couldn't afford. Breaking them wasn't just about escaping Thomas or disappointing my father. It was about reclaiming the right to be a whole person, someone with wants and needs and dreams that belonged to me alone." David nodded, understanding in a way that only someone who'd watched her journey could truly comprehend. He'd never been trapped by the same kinds of promises, had grown up in that cramped apartment above his father's bookshop, with love that was freely given rather than carefully measured. But he'd seen what those cold promises had done to Elena, had watched her slowly thaw into the person she'd always been meant to become. And he understood that the breaking had been necessary, that some cages can only be opened from the inside. They walked in silence for a while, their footprints trailing behind them in paired lines, evidence of parallel journeys that had chosen to intertwine. Elena found herself thinking about her sister Olivia, still living in the Hastings estate, still navigating the expectations and obligations that Elena had fled. She'd written to Olivia twice since returning from Port Merrick, careful letters that said everything and nothing, that tried to offer solidarity without judgment, hope without pressure. Olivia had written back once, a short note that suggested she was watching, learning, gathering her own courage for whatever breaking might be necessary in her own life. "I want to do something," Elena said suddenly, the idea forming as she spoke it aloud. "With the cottage, or maybe somewhere else, a place where people can go when they're trying to break their own cold promises. Not physically necessarily. I mean, some people might need actual refuge, but mostly I'm thinking about a space for honesty. For saying the things we're not supposed to say. For admitting that duty isn't the same as love, that sacrifice isn't always noble, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose yourself." David stopped walking, turned to face her, and she could see him thinking through the logistics already, seeing structure where she saw only possibility. "Like a community," he said slowly. "People who've escaped their own versions of what we escaped. People who understand that breaking promises made on your behalf isn't selfishness, it's survival." Elena felt something spark in her chest, hope or purpose, or maybe just the recognition that their story didn't have to end with their own escape, that survival could transform into solidarity, that freedom gained could become freedom given. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that, because Thomas and Marcus aren't unique. There are thousands of people out there trapped by promises they never made, by expectations they never agreed to, by lives that were decided before they were old enough to have opinions. And they need to know that escape is possible, that there's life on the other side of breaking." They returned to the cottage that night with a new kind of energy. the exhaustion of Port Merrick replaced by the invigoration of purpose. They talked for hours, planning in the way that people do when ideas are still dreams, when possibility hasn't yet been constrained by reality. They would start small, maybe just a newsletter or a gathering space online where people could share their stories anonymously, where they could find others who understood that choosing yourself wasn't abandonment, that breaking free wasn't betrayal, that love, real love, could only exist when it was freely chosen rather than dutifully performed. In the months that followed, Elena and David built something neither of them had expected when they first met in that forgotten manor, with its wild gardens and promise of restoration. They created a website called Beyond the Promise, simple and stark, with a single message on its homepage. If you're living a life someone else chose for you, this is your permission to choose differently. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from people all over the world. Daughters promised to their fathers business partners, sons expected to inherit careers they never wanted, people trapped by family expectations or cultural obligations, or their own internalized sense that their desires mattered less than everyone else's comfort. Some stories were dramatic. Engagements broken, fortunes abandoned, families left behind in the night. But most were quieter. A woman who finally pursued the degree she wanted, rather than the one her parents demanded. A man who admitted he didn't want children despite decades of family pressure. A person who chose their authentic identity over the role they'd been assigned at birth. Each story was different, but they all shared a common thread: the recognition that cold promises made without consent and enforced through obligation, were cages that only the caged could open. Elena thought often about her father during this time, about his death and the complicated grief it had left behind. She'd spent so much of her life angry at him, resenting the way he'd traded her future for business advantage, but she'd come to understand that he'd been trapped too, in his own way. The Hastings legacy, the weight of generations of expectation. He'd carried it like a cross, had sacrificed his own happiness and his family's to preserve something that, in the end, hadn't been worth preserving. His cold promises hadn't made him powerful or fulfilled. They'd made him lonely, rigid, unable to connect with his own daughters except through the language of duty and obligation. She wondered sometimes if he'd known, in those final moments, that the life he'd built was a prison of his own making. She wondered if the softening she'd seen in his face had been relief, not at dying, but at being released from the burden of maintaining all those careful walls, all those prescribed relationships, all those promises that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. One evening, almost a year after Port Merrick, a car pulled up to the cottage. Elena watched from the window as Thomas emerged, followed by a figure she didn't immediately recognize. And then the figure moved into the light, and Elena's breath caught. Marcus. Older, different somehow, steadier, more solid, as if he'd found weight in the world rather than just taking up space in it. Thomas saw her watching and waved, tentative, asking permission, and Elena nodded, already moving toward the door. They sat on the cottage porch as the sun set. 4 people who'd become unlikely allies, unlikely friends, unlikely proof that cold promises could be broken and survived. Marcus told them about his year away, the fear that had gradually transformed into possibility, the work he'd found in that distant place, the slow process of building an identity that belonged to him rather than being defined by who he was running from. Thomas talked about the aftermath at the Carmichael estate, the anger and disappointment that had eventually cooled into resigned acceptance, his family's realization that they couldn't force him into a life he didn't want, even if they never fully understood his choices. "We can't live together," Thomas said, his hand finding Marcus's, their fingers intertwining with the easy comfort of people who'd earned their intimacy through trial. "Not in the way we'd like. Not publicly, not where our families can see and judge and interfere. But we found a place, a small town, Nobody knows us there. Nobody cares about family names or business connections. We have an apartment above a bookshop, actually," he added with a small smile toward David. Funny how things circle back. Elena felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from joy or sorrow or some complicated mixture of both, she couldn't say. They'd escaped, all of them, but escape came with costs, with compromises, with the understanding that freedom wasn't the same as easy. Thomas and Marcus would never have the life they might have chosen if the world were different, if love were valued more than legacy, if people were allowed to write their own stories from the beginning rather than having to break free and start over in the middle. But they had something. They had each other. They had mornings and evenings, private moments, the accumulation of small, ordinary happiness that added up to a life worth living. And that was more than they'd had a year ago. More than they'd thought possible when Marcus was hiding beneath a warehouse, waiting to board a ship toward uncertainty. David brought out tea, and they sat together as darkness fell, as stars began to appear in the vast expanse above them. And Elena thought about the question that had started this whole cascade of choices. A wedding without a bride, 300 guests waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. She'd thought at the time that she was destroying something, breaking something precious and irreplaceable. But sitting here now, watching Thomas and Marcus lean into each other with the unconscious intimacy of people who'd fought for their right to be together. Watching David move through the space they'd built with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She understood that she hadn't destroyed anything. She'd freed everyone, including herself, including Thomas, including indirectly Marcus. The cathedral that day hadn't been the site of a destruction, but of a birth. The moment when all of them stopped living lives dictated by cold promises and started living lives chosen by warm hearts, by honest desires, by the complicated and messy and beautiful process of figuring out who they actually were beneath all the expectations. They stayed late, these four unlikely companions, trading stories and silence in equal measure. And when Thomas and Marcus finally left, driving back toward their small town and their apartment above the bookshop, Elena and David stood on the porch watching their taillights disappear into the darkness. The sea continued its endless conversation below them, patient and indifferent, and Elena felt something settle in her chest, something that might have been peace, or might have been acceptance, or might have been simply the recognition that she'd lived, truly lived, that she'd made choices that mattered and faced consequences and come through them changed but intact. "Do you think everyone gets the chance?" David asked quietly. "To break their cold promises? To choose themselves?" Elena considered this, the question hanging in the salt air between them. "No," she said honestly. "Some people never realize they're trapped. Some people realize it but don't have the resources or support to escape. Some people choose to stay because leaving would cost more than they can afford to pay, and that's okay too. Breaking free isn't the only way to be brave. Sometimes staying and finding small rebellions, small ways to be authentic within the constraints, that takes its own kind of courage." She thought about her mother, still living in the Hastings estate, still maintaining the careful social calendar and the perfect appearance, but who had, in her own way, softened after her husband's death. She'd sent Elena a letter 2 months ago, brief and formal, but it had ended with a line that had made Elena cry. "I never told you this, but I'm glad you ran. I wish I'd been that brave." That was the thing about cold promises. They didn't just trap the people who were promised. They trapped everyone who participated in the system, everyone who enforced the rules, everyone who believed that love was something to be managed and controlled, rather than something to be chosen and celebrated. Her mother had lived her entire life in service to promises she'd made, or that had been made for her, and only now, in her 60s, was she beginning to glimpse what she'd lost, what she'd sacrificed, what she'd never allowed herself to want. Elena pulled David close, felt the solid warmth of him, the reality of this choice she made every day. "I think the question isn't whether everyone gets the chance to break free," she said. It's whether we, the ones who did break free, whether we use that freedom to help others see their chains, whether we build something that makes escape easier, that makes choosing yourself feel possible instead of selfish, that reminds people that their lives belong to them, not to their families or their communities or their traditions. David kissed the top of her head, and they stood there in the darkness, two people who'd found each other by accident and built something intentional from that chance encounter. Behind them, the cottage glowed with warm light, proof of what was possible when you chose truth over convenience, love over obligation, authenticity over approval. It wasn't perfect. It was small and modest and required constant work, constant choosing, constant recommitment to the decision to live honestly. But it was theirs, wholly, completely, undeniably theirs. And that made it worth more than any cathedral full of guests, any merger of family estates, any cold promise made by people who confused control with care, duty with devotion. The weeks turned into months, and the months began to accumulate into something that looked like a future. Beyond the promise grew beyond what Elena and David had imagined, becoming not just a website but a movement, a community, a network of people who'd chosen themselves and were learning what to do with that choice. Elena spent her days writing, responding to messages, creating resources for people trying to navigate the complicated process of breaking free. David designed spaces, sometimes physical, sometimes metaphorical, where people could gather and be honest about the promises they were carrying, the weights they were learning to set down. And sometimes, late at night, when the cottage was quiet and the sea was loud, Elena would think about that moment in her father's study when she was 7 years old, when she first learned her life had been decided without her consent. She'd been so small then, so powerless, with no language for protest and no understanding that protest was even possible. That little girl had carried the weight of that promise for 16 years before finally finding the courage to put it down, to walk away, to risk everything for the possibility of belonging to herself. Elena wished she could go back and tell that little girl what was waiting, not just the escape, but what came after. The cottage and the sea and the man who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. The purpose found in helping others break their own chains. The complicated joy of living a life that was entirely, authentically hers, with all the terror and beauty that entailed. The understanding that cold promises made without consent and enforced through obligation, were never binding in the way they pretended to be. That the only promises that mattered were the ones freely given and freely received. But maybe that little girl already knew, in some deep place that adults forget how to access. Maybe that's why she'd held on, why she'd survived all those years of being told who she was supposed to become. Because somewhere in her small, powerless body, she'd known that promises made in cold blood could be broken, that cages could be opened, that someday, somehow, she would find her way to herself. And she had. Against all odds, against all expectations, against the weight of generations of cold promises and colder traditions, she had. They all had. Thomas and Marcus, in their apartment above the bookshop. Olivia, still finding her own way toward whatever breaking would be necessary in her life. The thousands of people who'd found beyond the promise and realized they weren't alone, weren't selfish, weren't broken for wanting to belong to themselves. The cathedral that day, the one with 300 guests and no bride, it hadn't been the ending of anything. It had been the beginning. The moment when cold promises started to shatter, when the possibility of choice became visible, when love, real, chosen, authentic love, began to emerge from beneath the weight of obligation. Elena turned to David, her partner in this wild, unlikely, beautiful life they'd built from broken pieces and brave choices. "Thank you," she said, though the words felt inadequate for what she meant, for what he'd given her simply by seeing her, by making space for her to become whoever she needed to become. He smiled. The same smile that had captured her attention that first morning at the manor, the one that suggested infinite possibility. "Thank you for choosing this," he said, "for choosing us, for being brave enough to break what needed breaking." And as they stood there on their porch, overlooking the sea, with stars scattered across the sky like promises waiting to be made, Elena understood the truth that had been at the heart of this whole long journey. Cold promises. Promises made without consent, without love, without care for the people they bound. Those could be broken. Should be broken. Must be broken if anyone trapped by them was ever going to learn what it meant to be fully, completely, authentically alive. But warm promises, promises made freely between people who saw each other clearly and chose each other anyway, those were sacred. Those were worth keeping. Those were worth building lives around. The question that had started everything, the wedding without a bride, had been answered not in a moment, but across months, across choices, across the slow accumulation of days spent living honestly. And the answer was this: sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to honor a loveless promise. Sometimes the bravest thing you can be is the person you actually are, rather than the person everyone expects. Sometimes shattering what looks solid is the only way to build something real. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, breaking free means not just escaping a prison, but discovering that others have been waiting, hoping, believing that escape was possible, that cold promises could be transformed into warm ones, that love, real love, was always worth choosing, always worth fighting for, always worth the beautiful, terrifying leap into uncertainty. Retry TM.